Welcome to Rise Up in Business, the law podcast for small business owners. I'm your host, Tracy Myler-Crane. I'm a business lawyer, an entrepreneur, and very much a realist. Rise Up in Business is designed to share with small business owners important legal information and some clever tips and tricks in short and sharp episodes, no legal jargon. With this podcast, I want to empower small business owners to rise up and take control in their business. I'll be here every Wednesday to tell you what you need to know without sending you to sleep. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome to episode 7. I cannot believe that I am recording the 7th episode of this podcast for its first season. I could not be loving this more. Today I want to talk about commercial leasing for small businesses. This is a topic that's come up more and more lately, particularly with what we've experienced this year and the pressure that small business owners have been under. What I have found is that when entering into a commercial lease, particularly for the first time, many small business owners aren't taking the time to get the advice that they need. This is a classic, we don't know what we don't know, and I always say that's okay. We don't know what we don't know, and that's okay, but we do need to surround ourselves with the right team of advisors that can help us with those things that we just don't know. Commercial leasing is one of those things. I want to touch today on several points that I think are really important for small business owners to understand and be aware of before they enter into a commercial lease. This is going to be particularly helpful for those small business owners who haven't entered into a commercial lease before, because these are the key things that you need to be aware of, in my view. First and foremost, it's important to understand that there actually are rules and obligations relating to what landlords or lessors can and can't do when offering a tenant terms for a commercial lease. That's one of the reasons why it is super important to get proper legal advice in relation to what has been offered, so that you really are putting yourself in the best position going forward and you know that you do have a commercial lease on terms that are fair and lawful. So when we're entering into a commercial lease, it's important to understand that there are going to be two key documents for this process. One is your disclosure statement and one is the lease itself. You need both, and you need to read both together. The disclosure statement is essentially a summary or an overview of the key terms that are going to be reflected in the sublease. You need to know what it says. You need to read them together. I do have clients who are finding themselves in difficulty lately because they have one without the other. It's just not possible to understand the full relationship that governs the lease if we don't have both. So be aware of that. You need to understand the term of the lease. That might sound simple, but it's often overlooked. Often there are options to renew the lease, and that forms part of the term. How long is your lease for, and do you have options to renew? That is, do you have the right to request a new lease after the initial term expires? When we're talking about options to renew, it is really critical that you understand that there are things that you can do that can jeopardise your right to exercise that option. So there are things you can do that compromise your ability to put your hand up at the end of your first term to say to the landlord or the lessor, yes, please, I'd like to enter into another lease on the same terms. You must comply with the essential terms of your lease, and one of the fundamentals is paying your rent on time. Most business owners say, yes, of course, I always pay my bills on time. But sometimes things happen and you can be a little late here and there. It is vital for the health of your relationship with your landlord or your lessor to pay your lease in accordance with the dates set out in your lease document. Absolutely vital. I can't stress that enough. If you do have an option to renew your lease, there will be a time frame in your lease document which sets out how it is you need to communicate to the lessor or the landlord that you want to that you want to exercise your option, and when you need to exercise that option. For example, it's common that the lease will say that you need to provide written notice to the lessor no more than 6 months and no less than 3 months prior to the expiry date. That is a very important part of your lease, because if you actually miss that date, and even if you're a day outside that time frame, when you write to the owner and say, I'd like a new lease, there is no longer a legal obligation on the owner or the lessor to give you that new lease. So it is critical that when you enter into your lease, you understand the term, you understand the options, and then you go and make a note in your calendar or your schedule somewhere telling you when that window or when that time frame is for you to exercise the option to enter into the new lease. This can sound confusing. It can be a little overwhelming. Again, that's why we surround ourselves with the right advisors, because this is something that your business lawyer absolutely should and could explain to you when you're entering into the lease. The next thing is rent. Sounds obvious, it's not always. You need to know the rent amounts, whether they're inclusive or exclusive of GST. You need to know the exact date that your rent is due and payable, and you need to know what the lease says about rent increases. So there's a couple of different ways that your rent can increase. Usually it's a fixed increase or a CPI or a market review on the anniversary, usually, of the commencement of the lease. So annually, every year on the 23rd of March, whenever it is you entered into it, there's likely to be a provision that your rental amounts will increase. You need to know what they are so you can factor them into your budgets and your cash flows. The next one is outgoings. Almost all commercial leases will have a component where outgoings are payable by you as the tenant. You need to be crystal clear on what it is you are responsible to pay. So there will always be the rent, and most of the time there'll be an additional sum that you have to pay for outgoings. You need to be crystal clear on what those outgoings are and how much they are, because again, you need to factor that into your budget and your cash flow. Next, I want to talk about security requirements. Most of the time, a commercial lease will require a bond of some sort to be held, usually by way of a bank guarantee or some other bond arrangement, where you're paying a sum, commonly an amount equivalent to 3 months' rent, to the owner or the lessor to hold as your bond. It's your security. So that's one component. The next component is if the tenant is a company, so if you operate your small business as a company, most of the time the owner or the lessor will require an additional security, being a personal guarantee by the directors of that company. It's common, but you need to be very clear on what it is you're providing when you agree to enter into the lease. I have had circumstances where clients have come to me. They have actually signed, as a director of their company, they've signed a personal guarantee under the lease, but they didn't realise that that was the case. So for whatever reason, it wasn't explained to them. They didn't appreciate what they were signing, but what it meant is that they were personally liable for the costs and liabilities under that lease. So it's very important that we know precisely what it is that we're agreeing to and signing up to. It's very important that we know exactly what security we're offering for this commercial lease. The next one is your fit out and your tenant works. If you're going into a premises where you need to do the fit out, then you need to be clear on what it is you're entitled to do and what it is you need to get consent to do from the owner. This then extends into make good. So at the end of your lease, there'll be a clause in the lease which says you need to make good the premises and put them into the condition they were in when you took over the lease. This is really important to understand when you're doing a fit out, because it can be a very costly exercise when your lease expires or you're moving on for whatever reason. It can be a very costly exercise to make good the premises, which in some cases can mean you have to remove the entire fit out and put the premises back to base building, so back to the condition they were in when you moved in. If you haven't budgeted for that or allowed for those costs in your cash flow, that can be a crippling impact. I've seen that happen. We can sometimes negotiate with landlords for some of the fit out to be left or to remain. It can be very valuable, potentially, to an incoming tenant, but unfortunately that doesn't happen always. And if you haven't factored that in, that can have very serious consequences. Finally is an exit strategy. Like I say, with any commercial transaction or any contract, when we're entering into it, we always need to be clear on what our exit strategy is. A commercial lease is no different. That is certainly something that you should talk to your business lawyer about when you're taking advice at the outset and when you're considering whether or not to enter into the commercial lease. So I hope that's been helpful. I do appreciate that there's a lot of information there, but I do genuinely think that each of those points I've just touched on are vital to understand when you are making a decision as to whether or not to enter into a commercial lease. So to recap, we've got the term of the lease and the options to renew, your rent amounts and your increases, your outgoings, make sure you understand what they are and how much they are. Security requirements, be crystal clear if you have to provide a bank guarantee or a bond, and if you're a company, understand whether you need to provide director guarantees, and your fit out and make good. Be very, very clear about what it is you can and can't do, and then what your obligations will be at the expiry of the lease. Always be clear on an exit strategy. That applies to anything. I hope that's been helpful. As always, you know where I am if you have any questions. That's it for today's episode. Short and sharp, just like I promised. If you liked the episode, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any new episodes, and I would be most grateful if you would leave a review on Apple Podcast. As always, remember to keep your business legals in order with my Business Legal Strength Check. Grab your free copy by heading over to my website, tmsolicitor.com.au. I'll catch you next Wednesday. Thanks so much for listening.